Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here talking about some research that was in part funded by the GBLCC. This is an aerial view of the canyon that I'll be talking about today, Porter Canyon Experimental Watershed. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Rosemary Carroll and Justin Huntington from the Desert Research Institute that did the modeling work, Tamsin Stringham from UNR that did the vegetation work as well as other work. And I'd also like to get my acknowledgments out there up front because a lot of people were instrumental. Bryce Weehan works for me. He helped a lot for this presentation with our statistical package and scaling sap flow. And Richard Gisoni at DRI provided us with a sap flow macro. All these other people also work for me. My lab was responsible for doing the large share of the instrumentation out of Porter, and that's a tough job. These people were willing to work long hours, carry lots of heavy things up hillsides, but they also took the time to really learn the instrumentation, get involved in the data, and take ownership. So they're pretty much rock stars. And for those of you who don't know me, that's me, the voice behind the slides. So while they work, I can sit here and play on this laptop out in the field. So what's the problem? The problem is Pinyon and Juniper expansion into sagebrush systems. It's estimated that there's 18 million hectares of this in the Intermountain West, and that prior to 1860, 2/3 of this was treeless. So what are the causes of this expansion since the late 1860s? Climate change, historical grazing practices, and fire suppression. And here we see sort of the natural progression. So in phase one, you have this scattering of trees, a more savanna-type ecosystem. As time progresses, you get to phase two, which has a more closed canopy. You still have some understory species, but you're starting to lose some of them. Phase three, you have almost full canopy closure and almost a complete lack of understory species. The consequences of this expansion are catastrophic wildfires, the potential for catastrophic wildfires. After those happen, you can have invasive weeds recolonize the site, such as cheatgrass. You can also get hydrophobic soils, which lead to increased erosion and runoff. And you have just a general loss of ecosystem diversity and potential shifts in the water budget, which is what I will be addressing today. This is a picture from Robin Tausch, pretty classic for anyone who's ever heard a presentation on this before. But you see in 34 years, you can move from phase one to phase two, from phase two to phase three. This is not the Desatoyas, this is the Shoshone Mountains in Nevada. So what is the water budget? I'm going to just get these terms out of the way. So precipitation, PPT, is equal to evapotranspiration, ET, you'll be seeing that a lot, plus runoff minus recharge. And what's evapotranspiration? That's a lump term that includes soil evaporation, plus plant transpiration, plus physical interception losses of precipitation from plant canopies. Mainly today, I'm going to talk a lot about this plant transpiration term because that's kind of my specialty, although we'll be doing the other terms later. You can ask me to come back next year. Recharge is changes in soil potential evapotranspiration. And this is the amount of evaporation and transpiration that would occur if water was not limiting. However, we live in a desert, so it is limiting. So this is water use by vegetation. On the y-axis, you have that ET term that I just described. On the x-axis, you have rainfall. So this is data redrawn from Zhang. It's actual real data. And it's well known that as you go from forested, so this is forested in the triangles, as you convert from forested vegetation to either mixed shrubland and grassland or grass types, these circles, you get a savings in this ET term. So you get shifts in the water budget. However, when you're in the arid environment, you're so limited by water and potential evapotranspiration exceeds inputs by so much, it doesn't really matter what's present on the landscape. landscape. All water is pretty much lost through that ET term. What I'm dealing with today and trying to call your attention to is the semi-arid region. And you can get shifts in the water budget when you go from forested to more grass types, but it's not always clear what direction they're going to be. Porter Canyon is hovering somewhere over here. And there's just a lot more acknowledged uncertainty in semi-arid. And almost all this data that Zhang used is from the chaparral, in like Mediterranean chaparral types of vegetation. There's very little work that's actually been done in the Great Basin where this question's pretty important. And the reason that it's so uncertain is that really when you lose tree cover, you might have a savings from reduced interception and transpiration by trees, but you also get reduced shading, which can increase soil evaporation. So you got to see how these things play out. Because of this uncertainty, Huxman and Wilcox developed a conceptual model for where on the landscape, if you take woody plants out, might you actually see stream flow in semi-arid systems. And these are in these hydrologically sensitive areas where woody plants basically can access water at depths that the shrubs and the grasses cannot. So there's three criterion, the first being physiography. Is shallow groundwater present? That's pretty easy. You're more likely to have stream flow if you've got shallow groundwater. The second is really important, and especially for the Great Basin, is climate. Is precipitation out of phase with potential evapotranspiration? So these are Mediterranean climates or snow-dominated climates like the Great Basin, where the recharge happens at the time when the plants can be dormant and thereby allowing water to go down deep. And then this recharge potential, and that's really a soil water holding component. Is there deep enough soil to store this moisture once it's past the root zone? So in Porter Canyon, we have very shallow soils up on those hill slopes. So does this fractured bedrock actually have the potential to seasonally store water? So we have the opportunity in Porter Canyon to ask, will water yield increase in a Great Basin watershed as a result of Pinyon and Juniper treatment? And you'll often see I switch between PJ and Pinyon and Juniper, but the same thing. So we actually were able to fell some trees. We'll be felling more in the future to ask, will we get increased stream flow or changes in the water budget? And it's a perfect opportunity for integrated modeling, which I will be discussing later. So the Porter Canyon project is in the Desatoya Mountain range. It's 3 hours east of Reno. You can see on the inset in a 12 to 16-inch precipitation zone. We're looking from the air here at Porter Canyon. The red outline is the watershed boundary. This interior green looks like an L. That is where we first were invited to work in 2009. That's a private in-holding. The rest is managed by the BLM. So in order to address these questions, we had to set up an integrated sensor network to measure the water budget components. So sap flow, I also alternate between that and water use, but it's basically the water use of trees. So we have sap flow probes on Pinyon and Juniper on hill slopes and in valleys, a lot of them, 52 trees, 2 probes per tree. We have novel methods to measure sagebrush sap flow, which again I'll return next year to talk about that. And we have soil moisture probes in all of our treatments. We have groundwater monitoring piezometers in the meadow, 2 instrumented strings, 4 flumes in the contributing channels, ultrasonic sonics to measure snow depth, cameras to assess phenology, soil temperature sensors in all our treatments, vegetation transects, and this NRCS snow-tell station to measure all the micrometeorological variables. So this is just how our instrument array is set out spatially on the landscape. I'd like to call your attention in this L, that private land holding. They got money for habitat improvement from the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2009 to take these trees out. So that's this bathtub ring that you're seeing up here. So that's when we started working there. They said, hey, you want to study stuff? We were like, yeah. So they left us what we call our postage stamps. These were intact trees that they left. There's approximately 1 hectare on each aspect, east aspect, west aspect. So we have 3 treatments out there, cut in 2009, intact forest today, forest that we saved and harvested in 2014, replicated. And these are this is the meadow system, and these are the groundwater monitoring transects that we have laid out. There's our scan station. Here's where our sage site, and then we also have trees in the valley. And at each of these sites, all those dots are all the instrumentation. There's lots of instrumentation. So finally, a ground level view with our government suburban for scale. So you can see the cut line. We have single-leaf pinyon and Utah juniper that have expanded downslope where they didn't used to be. It was historically more of a mountain sagebrush community with some low sagebrush and a higher component of perennial grasses. Now these trees have encroached, and the most common native grasses we have left are Poa secunda, Sandberg's bluegrass, and Idaho fescue. We've got, those are the trees and the postage stamps. We've got two channels that come down and contribute into a main channel that runs through this meadow. The meadow was historically a wet meadow, but it's drying out. And also historically, there's a 1 cubic foot per centimeter water right that was given to the homestead there in the early, I don't even know when, early 1900s or late 1800s. We're not sure, it rarely flows today, and it's interesting to try and figure out how much it flowed in the past. So we've had this one cut. We're also partnering with the BLM, and they are going to cut. This is their cutting treatment map, but over the next 5 years, they'll do a phased removal or thinning on another 2,200 acres, and we're poised to measure that hydrologic response. So first I'm going to talk about plant phenology because we have all these different cover types out there, and phenology is really critical to the water budget. So this is one of the cameras that GVLCC funded, and this is the view from the camera. So we have these cameras. They take 5 images 365 days a year to produce a lot of images. We draw these regions of interest. This is our wet meadow. It's dominated by Baltic brush and Nebraska sedge. This is our mesic meadow, dominated by Douglas sedge and field sedge with a little Baltic brush. And this is what we call our degraded meadow, which, as you can see, is dominated by sagebrush, rabbit brush, and a little bit of western wheatgrass. So we take these 3 regions of interest. We use our statistical package with a module called PhenoPix, and we run these images through, and we extract the red, the green, and the blue pixels to come up with the percent greenness. So that's what these data look like. So on the y-axis, you have percent greenness. This is not NDVI. It's different than that. We can actually get NDVI from these cameras, but we're still working on that, but we're pretty excited about that. So what to notice first? You have the black line is the median, and the gray lines are the 10 to 90th percentile, so the noise from the median. So you have this upturn date in red. That's when plants start to green up. Then you have a stabilization date in green. Then you have this dry down date, where the plants start getting less green. They're not dormant. They're not dormant yet. They're senescing. They're still physiologically active. And in fact, I think we should be adding another inflection point right here, which is when they really, as you can look through the pictures, tell that they are now dormant. And then this is the dormancy date. So we have that wet mesic and dry meadow, and what we notice is this wet meadow really waits a much longer time to green up than the mesic meadow. So we were wondering what's going on there. Then everything, peaks out about early June. This has a shorter window of phenological activity compared to the mesic meadow, which has a longer window of phenology. And then, of course, the dry meadow has a very long, but that shouldn't be, I shouldn't be telling land managers anything that they don't already know. Sagebrush is never really leafless. It turns over its leaves and looks a lot the same much of the year. So that's just reflected in this line. So we asked, well, why? So those are those median lines drawn on top of each other. So you can really see that the wet meadow has this peak in greenness compared to the mesic meadow and the degraded meadow. So what's going on? Well, these two types, the dry and the mesic, they don't have any obligate species in them. Nebraska sedge is the only obligate pharatophyte. These are either facultative species or upland species. So in the purple line, that's soil moisture at 8 inches, volumetric soil moisture. You can really see when that pulse of soil moisture increases, that turns those community types on. But Nebraska sedge is obligate. It's used to having water around. So this black line is average temperature, and it waits until the temperature bumps up. So temperature is its trigger. So that was pretty interesting to get from cameras. Now I'm going to show you the sagebrush. We drew 3 regions of interest. The black is the community average. It includes everything. Then we had just the sagebrush canopy in this red outline. And we also separated the interspace, which is a smaller fraction of the area, but we were still interested in looking at the response right in this interspace. These data are plotted on the same scale as the metadata, so you get an idea that they don't ever get as green because it's mostly sagebrush. What was nice here is that the average was actually an average between sage canopy and the sage interspace. I'm going to put all the dates on. What was interesting here is the sage interspace really started very early, again, like that music meadow. So I went and I hand-clicked through all the actual images. Instead of using R, I used my eye. And I was like, what's going on? Well, this is 2015. As you might remember, it's nothing like today out there in Reno. It was super dry in January, February, and March. There was no snow on the ground. It looked like fall. It was pretty warm. And this is actually Sandberg's bluegrass, Poe secunda, whatever you want to call it. It actually, yes, it thought it was spring, and it started to green up. You can see it. And then, wow, what happened? So we're addressing this huge variability in this upturn date. So it did start to turn on, but then, oh, end of March, we got a snowstorm. Not big snowstorms. They were only present for 1 or 2 days on the ground. We got 2 snowstorms in April and 1 in May. So yeah, the plant was a little confused. It gets green, it gets covered by snow, it gets more green, and then you can see it really upturns right here, and then has a pretty short season between June 1st and June 26th, which is exactly what we would expect from Poe secunda. It's early, but it doesn't stay green for very long. So what's this huge bar? Well, I went and I looked through the pictures again. Well, summer rain started, and as you might remember, again, not really normal for the Great Basin. We had pretty predictable pulses of summer rainfall last year, and this was not Poe secunda, but this is like Idaho fescue and some other forbs that were actually able to respond to these summer rainfall events. So again, just the lines, you can see the average really is an average dominated by the greater presence, but interestingly, seeing air temperature, soil moisture, all these communities turned on when soil moisture increased. And then the POA, which is presumably more shallow-rooted, as it dried down, it senesced. But the more deeply rooted sagebrush canopies was able to continue being physiologically active. So the take-home, this process can be used to quantify what we see on the ground. So land managers do this all the time. They go out there, and most people can see green, not all, but they go out there and they say, oh, but we can actually quantify this. We can take a subjective process and we can make it objective. We could put cameras in remote places and be able to use this tool. So that's all pretty neat. And we can develop useful relationships between plant phenology, soil moisture, and temperature in field environments. A lot of what we know about when plants green up is not always done in their field environment. So another useful thing. So this is just to change gears. We're now going to talk about plant water use in the valley trees and the east aspect trees. Sap flow. So sap flow or water use, how do we measure it? We build these needle probes in my lab. We insert one up and one down here. They're called thermal dissipation probes. Basically, this probe emits a pulse of heat, a known pulse of heat. Water flows up the sapwood or the xylem area, flows upward out through the leaves, so plants can photosynthesize. In doing so, it cools off that pulse of heat, and we can take the difference in heat between these two probes, and using some empirical equations and math, we can get sap flow. But this slide takes a bit. There are some challenges with this. So this is just a cross-sectional area of a tree, and we're interested in all this sapwood, that active conducting xylem. This inner portion is heartwood. It no longer conducts water. So what we do is we carefully remove the outer bark, the inner bark, and the cork cambium, and we insert these needles. And this probe is 2 centimeters long. So this is our 0 to 2 probe, and this is where it's heated. A lot of people stop there. A lot of ecophysiologists, that's what they do. And what do you get from that? You get a sap rate, a sap flux rate, a velocity in liters per meters per second. So why do people stop there? Well, that's the questions that they're intrinsically interested in, like differences between species, between ages, and what's driving sap flow. What my stakeholders are concerned with is a different question. How much water does a tree use? How much water does a stand use? This is more difficult to get to. To get to a volume, you need to scale to the active sapwood area, which means you have to develop relationships between diameter and cord trees. You got to sum over time. To get to the stand, you need to determine all the sapwood area per unit land area. And there's one more complication. There's a lot of literature out there for pine species that show that sap flow is not constant with depth, that it decreases with depth, which makes the math more difficult. So we went in and we put in all these other probes, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, and 6 to 8. And we were really, really hoping it would be constant across this whole sapwood area. It was for juniper. Juniper is more well-behaved in this case. Unfortunately for pinyon, sap flow decreases with depth, and quite a bit. So we had to develop a linear relationship with depth from all our variable probe trees in order to scale up to the whole tree and to the stand. Data. So this is the average transpiration of individual trees from a small window in July of 2012. So you can see the different size classes. We have medium pinyon and small pinyon in these red bars. We have medium juniper and small juniper in these green bars. And the top panel A is just that flux rate in liters per meters per square. So it doesn't matter how big you are. So here in the valley, all trees are pretty much doing the same thing in terms of their rate. But however, in the upland, this small pinyon really has a higher flux rate. So when you go that next gap and you scale to the individual trees, so now it matters what size you are if you're a medium pinyon. And here in the valley, interestingly, the medium pinyon is using substantially more water. This is about 33 liters per tree per day, whereas the small pinyon is getting by on 7 liters per tree per day, and the medium junipers are somewhere around 20 liters. So, and over here, what's really interesting, this is our upland with our really shallow soils, yet this, and everything's pretty much the same, but this medium juniper, wow, 32 liters per tree per day. So, you know, it's doing something different. So what do I think is going on? In the valley, the soils are deeper, and presumably these trees have greater access. They have access to a greater soil volume. So it seems like if you're a medium pinyon, you have enough rooting volume to be able to access more water when it is there. Now, in the upland, this is a really interesting question. Why is this juniper? So we only have like 25 centimeters to 50 centimeters of soil, and then we've got fractured bedrock. This has become a recent focus of ecophysiological literature, like how much water can be stored in fractured bedrock systems, because they're really prevalent in the West. And are trees able to use it, and how do we change our water use paradigms? Well, I would say this medium juniper might be a good one to study because it's getting water from somewhere. So, and this is just a comparison. This is just only medium pinyons in the wet year of 2011 versus the dry year of 2012. For a short period in July, we were just getting started on sap flux in 2011, our only wet year so far. But if you look across the valley habitats and across the upland habitats, what you see is there's nearly a 2.5 difference between water use. So we've got 70 liters per tree per day. So there's this magical historic 25, Pinyon uses 25 gallons of water a day. Well, that's kind of maybe where that came from. And, but anyway, so you see these big differences between wet and dry years. So now the number everybody's always after me to get to, how much water does an acre of trees use? So to do this, I took a daily average sap flow from my 15 instrumented trees on that east aspect for every day that I could get an average for, and used those to scale uninstrumented trees. I developed relationships with how sap flow varies with that sapwood depth, an allometric relationship on how tree diameter relates to sapwood area. We did this when we cut down all those trees in 2014. We had a lot of tree cookies to work with. And then we went out in those postage stamps and we measured all the diameters in the plots to scale to the stand level. All right, the big slide. So this is stand level water use from May 2012 to June 2013. Still a relatively dry period. This is a stand based on a stand of 130 trees. 64% of them were pinyon, 36% were juniper, and you have average stand level transpiration in liters per acre per day. So to get to a year, you still have to multiply all these dots by the number of days in a month. We'll get there next. But what was really interesting is I plotted them separately, and the red line here is juniper. And as you can see, this tree is well known for having a different drought strategy than pinyon. It's considered anxiohydric, which means it's able to tolerate very high levels of water stress without having to shut down its stomata. It can keep functioning it can keep photosynthesizing. If you photosynthesize, the cost of that is losing water. So, and I think this slide just really demonstrates in these really dry months when we know soil moisture is declining, this tree just chugs along, does its thing. Whereas pinyon is isohydric and is not drought tolerant. It cannot tolerate high levels of water stress. And you can see when so it has to shut down and stop photosynthesizing. So when water becomes available in the spring, you get these pulses where it really can upregulate and use more water. And this is just the sum of both of them, and this pattern is currently driven by pinyon because there's more of them. The other interest, so you can imagine how stand composition changes, you can change the shapes of these lines. The other really interesting thing to note is when we are dealing with woody plant encroachment, I probably should have said this like 20 minutes earlier, we're taking these deeply rooted, often evergreen trees and introducing them into areas that used to be dominated by more shallowly rooted things that are often deciduous. So even in the dead of winter, November, December, and January, these trees, they're not shut down. They're still using water. This number is not zero. So I'm calling these preliminary results because it's a number to be interpreted with caution. So at every step of that scaling, there's uncertainty involved. And I basically just summed it all up. So at a tree density of 130 trees with 33% pinyon canopy cover and 9% juniper cover and this much interspace, summed over a 12-month period, July 2012 to June 2013, 1 acre of trees used 6.8 centimeters of water per unit land area. Okay, so what does that number really mean? So managers are more interested in talking about acre feet of water. So this is about 280,000 liters of water per acre of tree per year, which is 23% of an acre foot. So a lot of people want to take that number and multiply that by all the areas of encroached pinyon and juniper. That's not a sensible thing to do, and we'll go over that in a minute. So this was from a dry period. Only 21 centimeters of precipitation actually fell during this period. So if you take the ratio of tree transpiration to actual precipitation, and this is done in the physiological literature a lot, this ratio is 32%. Now, as a classically trained ecophysiologist from semi-arid environments, I found this number shockingly low where we're taught that ET is 90% of the water budget. But let's remember, we're only talking about T. We are not accounting for bare ground E, transpiration by other plant species, the interception, so this number might be lower, of PPT due to the tree canopies. Yes, we're going to get there. So the caveats are it applies to this soil type, topography, tree density, and weather pattern. And really, I can't emphasize this enough. Other plants use water too. So soil evaporation, grasses, sagebrush. We're trying to nail down a number on this sagebrush component. And we can get some of this evaporation from all our soil moisture probes. Again, not sure what's going to happen in a wet year, but let's hope today is the start of that wet year because I've been waiting 4 years. So true water savings is unlikely in a semi-arid environment. And what I mean by this is taking a volume of water, picking it up, and making it leave Porter Canyon and putting it into another water. It's just because potential evapotranspiration is so high. What are we more likely to see is an internal redistribution of limited water resources. What's going to happen to evaporation? Maybe we'll get some stream flow. Maybe we'll get some groundwater recharge. Maybe we'll have more water discharged lower into that meadow that's suffering degradation. We'll definitely, if we take trees and we cut them down, we'll have more soil moisture available for our desired replacement sagebrush species. So how do we get there? Because we haven't been in Porter Canyon long enough to know the answers. We haven't harvested all those acres. We haven't had enough weather variability, but we want the answers. So this is where I teamed up with Rosemary and Justin at DRI for the Porter Canyon GS flow model. It's a physically based coupled surface and groundwater model. It is driven by physical parameters, so it's not, I've been talking about detailed physiology, it's not driven by that. It's driven by potential evapotranspiration, root zone water availability, and things like how deep are your soil layers, how deep is your alluvium, you know, what are your geologic constraints on this system. So, first thing you do, we had data from 1981 to 2013. We used the first 10 years to spin up, probably the only time I'll ever use that word in a presentation, to spin up the model. That's our calibration. We also did some independent calibration. We'll get to that in a minute. The first thing is this is the digital elevation model. We let landfire classify what is out on the landscape. 80% of that is Pinyon and Juniper. So baseline is no treatment. Everything that landfire classified is woodland, we let stay woodlands. And then we have the treatment, the 2009, where we actually removed what they removed, which was 140 acres. But look how approximately close this is to that meadow. That's the point to remember. And when I say we remove the trees, it's not bare ground. It's replaced by a mixture of shrub, bare ground, and grass. And then we have what we're calling our basin treatment, where we remain 20% of the Pinyon Juniper by area. So if you look at this above this elevation, so this is that white line, and we let all the trees stay here, and we convert this to that mixed shrub in the rest of the basin. And that's about 1,900 acres, which is, you know, not an unrealistic amount, considering the BLM is going to do quite a bit of treatment in that canyon. So first you run your baseline model. And this is the baseline model, years across the bottom, really wet years highlighted across the top. This is precipitation in millimeters. This is yield. This is not discharge out of the basin. This is the difference between precipitation and that EP term. So it's basically changes in recharge. So these blue bars are increased groundwater or soil water, but basically in periods of recharge. And these happen in these really wet, greater than 400 millimeter rainfall years. In the other years, when we're below this 400 millimeter threshold, those plants have to use stored water. That's depleting the storage. So Q is the stream flow, and what you can see is stream flow only happens in these incredibly wet years that were not that frequent, and we're calling those pluvial years. So 2011, no, there was no stream flow in this picture, but this remembers the baseline. Those 140 acres of trees right near the meadow are still there in the simulation. Then we asked, how well does the model work? So green line is the soil moisture from the model. When it's up here above 0, that's increased soil moisture. This is the model's depth to groundwater from the model. Of course, they agree. They're from the same model. So these lines, track really well. But then we said, well, what can we use? So Justin has a really neat Landsat tool where he can calculate NDVI at 30 meters resolution. So we did that for August. And what you can see is that NDVI is really tracking. When you have more increased soil moisture, shallow groundwater, that meadow vegetation, this is from the meadow, that the Landsat NDVI is a measure of plant vigor. So you can see when the meadow is more vigorous, when you have more water. And this is 2011, the year we all know about and remember because we were there. And that tracks really nicely. This was our depth to groundwater at the baseline condition. This is when we cut the 140 acres, and you can see that when you cut the 140 acres, this is when you get this response, So from here, this is with the baseline conditions, this is with the 140 acres cut. So an NDVI may offer us a mechanism to move towards the landscape scale. So then we looked at changes in vegetation on yield relative to the baseline model. And what you see is for that really small treatment that you got to squint, that's the blue, only in those really big, greater than 400 millimeter years did you get an increase in yield or a change in discharge. But in that big treatment where we took out a lot of trees, we do get a positive increase in yield. And we get increased stream flow. That stream flow generally happens in that wetter period as well. This is a result of decrease in that ET term. So when you cut down the trees, replace them with shrubs, you save transpiration, but it's also partially offset by that lack of shading. We had more sublimation. So that average change in yield, when you average those two ET terms, is about 4% increase. So that's good. But to go back to the depth to groundwater, here's the baseline, all the trees. Obviously, when you cut a lot, you had almost a 2.2 meter increase in groundwater depth in those meadows. But even in the baseline where those trees were harvested on that deeper aluminum, you're getting a 1.2 meter rebound in groundwater levels. So hydrologically, it's insignificant in terms of the yearly watershed budget, right? But if you're a meadow plant, 1.2 meters is huge. So that's really good. This could promote meadow health. The take-home NDVI correlates to GS flow simulated soil moisture and groundwater levels in the meadow. Treatment does increase recharge, but this does not translate into increased streamfall all the time. Instead, shallow groundwater levels rise and groundwater ET increases. And that means that the plants in the meadow are able to use water because it's there. Treatment must be fairly large to realize a small gain. To realize a fairly small gain, that's a +4 increase in recharge as a result of evaporative losses from snow. But the impact is to buffer these shallow groundwater levels during periods of drought, making the meadow more resilient. Last slide. So, conclusions. Phenocams are useful tools for quantifying what we see on the landscape, and we have them in all the other treatments. We just didn't present them. Water use can be quantified, but introduces uncertainties at multiple steps, but our estimates are reasonable given our precipitation inputs. We have a model that can be tested with real live tree treatments at the watershed scale. That's pretty exciting. Water surplus is unlikely, but it's possible to redistribute water to more desired plant communities like sagebrush and meadows. And this project has lots of collaboration. It's been great with the BLM, there's so many people involved. So lots of collaboration gets meaningful results and addresses big problems. we have more work to be done, so stay tuned. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Keirith. A lot of information here, which was very interesting. At this point, I'd like to turn control over to Liz Mack at EnviroIssues, who will be sharing some questions. Before we get into those questions, however, I want to remind all of those who are listening here today that we have a new feature to our webinar series, and that is an evaluation tool. It's a very brief set of questions that we ask you to answer upon signing off of the webinar, and it helps to provide some constructive feedback, not just to our presenter, but to the organizers of the webinar series. We'd like to make this set of talks even better as time goes by, so please do take just a few minutes that will be necessary to provide that feedback. So with that, I'd like to ask Liz Mack to share any questions that may have come in. Liz?
Yes, thanks, Rick. We have a couple questions here, and I'll just remind the audience that they can add questions into the chat box if they arise. So first question here is, did I hear correctly that 8 inches of precipitation during the month of May or June was considered dry?
No, we had 21 centimeters, or approximately 8 inches, from the period July 2012 through June 2013. So a 12-month period.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the next question here is, what do you think of the theory that PJ was removed over most of Nevada during the mining boom and is now recovering?
That's an excellent question, and actually we were discussing that before the webinar. Yes. So, you know, we always hear that it's a bad problem, this encroachment is a bad problem. You know, plants historically, we have a short time window from 1860 to the present. So historically, yes, there was more uses. People went out and harvested more trees, and some of this could be just a natural refilling of that. And yes, over longer time periods, you know, plants move upslope and downslope in response to changes in climate patterns. So yeah, I'm not saying we should get rid of every pinyon and juniper on the landscape. So I do think that, you know, some of the concerns for sage grouse and not just sage grouse, forage and other things that we care about on our rangelands, I think there are areas where this is, you know, a valuable thing to be considering to redirect limited water in a semi-arid environment.
Thank you. Here, the next question is, PJ moving downslope into mountain big sagebrush seems unusual, and they're asking, what is the elevation of the Porter Canyon study site?
So the base of Porter Canyon is 6,200 feet, and I don't think that it's unusual at all. It's quite actually common for pinyon and juniper to expand into mountain sagebrush.
Okay,
and obviously,
and then the next, go ahead.
But that's the base of the meadow is about 6,200 feet. I think I have that right. It might be 7,200. It might be 7,200 feet. Sorry, not good in feet.
And here, a next question for you is, do you think stream flow would increase with treatment in a drainage that had no meadow habitat?
That's actually a great question. And yes, I mean the meadow is a very valuable resource in Porter Canyon. It's also a geologically constrained meadow. It's there because there's a fault line. So yes, if that meadow didn't exist in Porter, it's much more likely that that water would actually generate as stream flow and flow downstream.
Okay, great. And a few more that have come in here on the chat box. The next one is, how are livestock managed?
So the livestock pass through there on their way up to the higher elevations in the spring. They actually hang out for a while in the spring, I think every other year, and then they're actually pushed up into the higher elevations of Porter Canyon. But it is an actively grazed allotment.
Okay, great. And a few more here. What about lateral transfer of water to your study plots? How could topographic information be used to target areas to remove PJ?
So I think, you know, when those trees were modeled that were taken out in the 140 acres that were in that deeper alluvium, that was probably an instance where lateral recharge was very important. So taking things out on deeper alluvium next to margins of hill slopes could be potentially more beneficial than something up at the very top of the hill. It's interesting to note, when they were cutting the trees in 2009, I wasn't actually there, but my collaborator said one of the groundwater wells that actually came in actually, you know, flowed above ground for a while after those trees were taken down right next to the meadow. So yes, I think it could be important.
Okay. And your next question here is, how will warming temperatures influence the prevalence of PJ encroachment?
Well, I'd say the previous warming, you know, they've, well, not so much warming, but climate change. With increases in CO2, they've been able to come downhill because their photosynthetic, their C3 pathways improved, and they can, you know, be more water use efficient at lower elevations. They're probably CO2 saturated now, honestly. So if it gets a lot warmer, they'll probably start going back uphill. So they'll probably recontract. So, but the other thing, I mean, it's a fascinating question, and we have a whole other modeling study on it. You know, what's going to happen with temperature, as temperature increases, we're going to get less snow and more rainfall, and that's going to be, I mean, that's just a great, interesting, fundamental question that fascinates me, but I don't know the answers. Contact me by email.
Great. And this next question is the model available for others to use?
So I don't know. So whoever wrote that question, you can email me and we can get with Rosemary.
Okay, I've got one more question here so far in the chat box, and that is, was there much of a response in the shallow groundwater table?
I'm not sure what they meant, but yes, that's actually what we showed. Even with only the 140 acre cut that was close to the meadow, we got a 1.2 rebound on average of groundwater levels. So yeah, only 140 acres of tree and a 6,000 acre 80% forested water level. Yeah, pretty big response because of their proximity and the strata they were rooted on. And then when we did the basin scale treatment, yes, there was a 2.2 meter increase, which the reason that line, I can't get back to my slides, but the reason that line went where you couldn't see it was because it was actually now ponding above the surface.
Okay, and one compliment from the audience here. They said this was a great presentation and very informative. And then follow-up question to that was the ratio of precipitation to transpiration that you showed was about 32%, which you say was surprisingly low. You did mention there are other sources of evaporation. I'm curious what this ratio is in other semi-arid areas that you have studied.
Now I feel like I'm back at my prelims. No. So, you know, when you're taught in arid and semi-arid areas that ET can exceed 90% of the water budget. So, but that's all evaporation and all plant transpiration. So when I said low, I think that, so yeah, I would not be surprised if plant T was 50 to 60%. Of course, if you went, and then total ET, but those bare spaces are really important. So what I was saying is almost 60%, even though we have that high density of trees, was pretty much inner space. So we got to look at soil E, and then all the transpiration from all the understory plants. So, and also, it was a dry period. So maybe that didn't come out, but it was exceptionally dry. So if there's more, if there's no water available, you can't use it. So in a wet year, that could shift again.
Okay, thank you. That was the last of the questions that have come in so far. Rick, do you have any questions from the audience in your room?
None at this end.
I think I do.
Oh, please.
And it ties back to a couple you answered. But because snow is the predominant precip form we get, and changing the canopy is going to change the way snow accumulates and then snow melt. So kind of a two-part question. Have you taken into account the timing of that, like the amount of accumulation and the timing of snow melt and what that would mean hydrologically?
Or in the watershed instrumentation?
Well, both, I suppose.
So that's another question that I'm excited to answer, and actually GBLCC helps fund some of that instrumentation as well, but we actually do have way more snow depth sensors than probably people. When I bought them, they're like, why do you need so many? Because we are looking in cut areas versus the intact forest, like how the snow falls, and then you can see the melt off as well by having these repeated cameras in the cut 09, the cut 14, the intact canopy, in the sage. The only way we don't have one is the meadows. So looking at how snow falls. We've also done actual field manipulations with a graduate student a few years ago, Sam Lossing, where we we simulated rainfall on a whole bunch of pinyon and juniper trees and looked at interception. And that's another reason why this 32% could actually bump up, because I said we got 21 centimeters of water, but we found on average that both pinyon and juniper, when they get rain, liquid rain, they intercept about 44% of that. So we haven't, so obviously I don't know if that number holds for snow interception. You can get a little bit at it with the ultrasonic sensors. And then this summer we're actually going to do that same kind of water interception, liquid water interception for sagebrush canopies. So yeah, interception is a component that I didn't talk about today because I can't talk about everything.
Right. and
we have so much more
the other
to talk about.
The question was, are you considering treatments that would capture snow? I mean, there's
like snow fencing or something?
Not fencing, but there's ways of harvesting trees
to
accentuate
I'd like to
accumulation.
talk about that further. What we've done so far to date in the 140 acres that the private rancher did was that was a very specific treatment done by a very good logger, where the trees were limbed up as high as you can go, and then they were felled perpendicular to the hill slope, so essentially across the hill slope, so that they would act as little dams to possibly accumulate, you know, snow and runoff or anything behind those trees. And if you go out on the landscape and you look at where those trees are, they're little islands of establishment for understory plants now, because they have helped with the moisture. So, and also I should just touch base, that interception that you asked me about is in the GS flow model. I don't know exactly how it's modeled because I didn't do that modeling, but yeah, so they do account for interception losses.
Okay. Liz, any more questions in the chat box?
Yeah, there One follow-up question also about snow here, which is what about snow sublimation, and how would you measure that?
So, well, the model obviously modeled it. What is snow sublimation? So snow sublimation is actually having enough energy to take snow and take it from snow form and get it out as water vapor. That takes a lot of energy, by the way. So not everything in the model is actually driven by sublimation. Some of it, and talking with the guy who helped build this model, Rich Niswanger, is so some sublimation can happen with the reduction in shading, but you can also just melt the snow down to liquid water and have it like go other, it's not, and act differently than if you just had snow melting into the top of the soil surface and then infiltrating and percolating down. And how would I measure sublimation? Yeah, I haven't measured sublimation, so. There's a collaborator at UNR, Adrian Harpold. He might be interested in doing that.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Dr. Snyder, for your great presentation and for taking these questions. That's really insightful. Thank you. It's a great presentation.
You're welcome.
And thank you, all, those who are still with us, for attending today's webinar. As I said earlier, a recording of this presentation will be available on our website later this week. If you have any questions about the LCC or this research, please feel free to contact Todd Hopkins or Dr. Snyder at the email addresses you see on the screen. Be sure to join us for our next presentation. This is on Tuesday, January 8th at 11 a.m. That's a new time, 11 a.m., December 8th, for a presentation on the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe's Climate Change Adaptation Planning with Dr. Carletta Chief from the University of Arizona. And again, last but not least, we really want to know what you thought of today's webinar. So please take our short survey, which will appear on your screen as you log off. Your feedback is really valuable.